So as Robin said, we'd like to talk a bit about the challenges and opportunities of collaboration across different institutions, whether they're health research institutions or other forms of implementing partners when it comes to testing a vaccine. And I know that the panelists' paths have crossed in other ways, but I know for a fact that all of them have worked on the Ebola vaccine trials in Sierra Leone toward the end of and after the 2014, 2016, 17 outbreak in West Africa. So I'll ask them to mostly focus on that, but other collaboration questions obviously are not off the table. They will introduce themselves, but to just discuss the trial very briefly and the ways that some of their work has intersected. The Ebola study was under the Department of Community Health at the College of Medicine and Allied Health Sciences, or COMAS, in Sierra Leone, and brought together several research institutions and NGOs, including the Ministry of Health and Sanitation in Sierra Leone, COMAS itself, Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, INSERM, World Vision, the Grameen Bank Foundation, and GOAL. And I don't even think that's a complete list, to be honest. So our panelists come from LSHTM. So we have Dr. Luisa Enria, Dr. Shelley Lees, who are medical anthropologists who worked on the social science and community engagement around the vaccine trial. John Johnson, who works with MSF, and Robert Kanwagi, who works with World Vision. And I'll ask them to describe their own roles and institutional roles across the panel so that we can get a look at collaboration a little bit closer based on the individual and institutional aims first. So Luisa and Shelley, I'd like to ask you to start, if you would, by describing your own role and your institution's role in the vaccine trials, Ebola vaccine trials. So your individual role and your institution's role, and then also talking about the strength that your institution brought. So what is that experience and background? What was the elements of experience that were needed from the institution where you were working that were brought to the vaccine trial?
Great, thanks, Mark. Shelley, can you hear us? I just see on the chat that you said that you can't.
We're just trying to help Shelley out with her sound.
Oh, okay,
so
all right.
I'll drop you a message when she's back on.
Okay, I'll go first then. Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I'm Luisa Enria, and I was the anthropologist at the setup of the Ebola vaccine trials in Sierra Leone, and have worked on the trials for the last 5 years in different capacities. And my role, sort of very briefly, was to, together with Shelley, who will talk a bit more about her experience and her perspectives, was to set up a social science research project to go alongside the vaccine trials. And our job really, with a team of local researchers in Sierra Leone and Gambia, where in the north of the country where the trials were taking place and are still taking place, our job was to do research on participant and community perspectives and experiences of the trial itself, but also to situate those experiences and those perspectives in the sort of social, cultural, and political context of the place where the trial was happening, of Gambia itself and of Sierra Leone more broadly. And I think in terms of, I think Mark, you asked what London School, and kind of especially from the social science perspective, what experience we were bringing. And I think aside from kind of a specific social science perspective and anthropological perspective, there was also some lessons learned, and Shelley can talk more about that from her experience in Tanzania with HIV trials, and that we tried to kind of adapt and change for the context of Sierra Leone, where I'd been working for a few years before the trial started, and then the specific expertise of the local social scientists that we hired and trained as well. But Shelley, hopefully you're back on now. You can add a bit more to that.
Hi, thanks, Luisa. Sorry, I couldn't hear, so I'm a bit out of touch with what the question is. So, Mark, Luisa, are you continuing, or do you want me to speak?
Thanks,
Sorry, I'm a
Luisa.
bit confused.
That's all right, Shelley. We're talking about your role in the Ebovax-Salone trial and your institution's role, and then what were the strengths that your institution brought to that role?
Okay. Yeah, thank you, and hello to everybody. Apologies for a technical hitch, as we seem to always have. I think sort of going back a little bit about the LSHTM and its role is that previous to the Ebovax-Salone trial, I had worked as an anthropologist on an HIV prevention trial in Tanzania, and I think there were with an HIV intervention trial, it was a trial of using microbicides, so it was very important to understand how women adhered to and used the gel, and therefore there was an understanding by DFID, who'd funded the trial, that we needed social science and community engagement. And I think HIV prevention trials really sort of forced or sort of ensured that a lot of social aspects of trials were considered. And with the Ebola epidemic and then the development of the Ebola vaccine trials and the Ebovax-Salone trial, I was still working at LSHTM, still working with colleagues who were then the PIs on the Ebovax-Salone trial, so Debbie Watson-Jones, Brian Greenwood and others, who had really understood the value of having social perspectives of participants and communities through trials. So I think we had a very strong institutional backing for social science and community engagement in the Ebovax-Salone trial. There's another question related to that, Mark? Sorry.
That's great for now, Shelley. Thank you. Robert, would you like to talk about your role and your institution's role on the trial, and then also talk about the strengths that your institution brought in that role?
Thank you. The Ebola Consortium was formed in which had London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as the lead of the consortium, World Vision Ireland, Grameen Foundation, and Janssen Pharmaceuticals. We, as part of the design, had different roles. Part of World Vision's role in this consortium was to work closely with London School to develop a communication and community engagement strategy that would look at all the local issues in terms of context and make sure that we are able to involve communities and recruit participants willingly to volunteer to be part of the Ebovax-Salone, this is in Sierra Leone, clinical trial. But apart from recruitment of participants through this strategy, the strategy also had another strong component, which was basically to ensure that participants comply in terms of prime boost vaccination. They are able to take the prime vaccine and also take the boost vaccination. So in this entire consortium of the 4 organizations I mentioned, World Vision was the only organization that had local presence in Sierra Leone. So part of what London School and Janssen looked at in selecting World Vision to be part of this consortium was to use its existing networks and strength, and the fact that they already been in Sierra Leone for more than 30 years to be able to navigate around all issues that would come as a result of having new partners operating in a new community. So we came on board basically because of our experience in working with these communities in Sierra Leone. We had been there during the war, post the war, and we were there during the outbreak. So we played a big role in navigating and supporting the consortium, leverage our local partnerships and networks. And my principal role in this was to work with my London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine colleagues to develop this strategy for communication and community engagement, and then work with my colleagues from Janssen to develop the enabling technologies that can also support communication and community engagement. And then, of course, working again in partnership with that consortium to identify staff locally that we could train, recruit to be the community facilitators of the work we are doing, and to provide all kind of logistical and operational support in the implementation of the project. So it was a role of ensuring that participants are recruited, participants comply to their booster vaccination, that communities are involved in the work that we are doing and they fully participate and are aware of the trial, and that the government, in terms of the departmental ministries, both at the center, the district, are fully engaged in the work they are doing, and they are providing feedback and input in the communication materials that we are developing.
Great, thanks so much for that, Robert. A really good overview of the World Vision's contribution and your contribution. John, would you like to tell us about your role, your institution's role, and the institutional strengths that your MSF brought?
Sure. So I have to start off by saying I actually wasn't involved in the West African studies, Ebovax alone, or Ebodac. I was actually involved with MSF in North Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo last year. We were part of a consortium with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, with the National Biological Research Institute of Congo. It's called the INRB, with Epicent, and we were collaborating with CEPI, Janssen, and the Ministry of Health of Congo. And then eventually World Vision was brought into the consortium for community engagement. My role was project lead for the study for MSF. MSF is typically an organization that does not focus too much on vaccination or therapeutic studies. We focus more on intervention with, drugs that have already been authorized and vaccines that have already been authorized for the market. But we felt this was a sort of an exceptional case. Ebola is a disease that is fairly rare. Fortunately, it's fairly rare, but that also gives us limited opportunity to test therapeutics and vaccines. And if you look at West Africa, that's where we saw the biggest increase in our medical knowledge about Ebola. And the ongoing outbreak in North Kivu really gave us another opportunity to advance the state of medical knowledge for therapeutics and for vaccines. And we really saw that the existing vaccine, the Merck vaccine, wasn't being deployed as effectively as it probably could have been. And there was another vaccine that had a good opportunity to be deployed. We felt like we should get involved, and so we did. Our role in this was really logistics, so supporting the putting in place of the study in the field, as well as community engagement, more door-to-door community engagement than anything else, and we also managed the vaccination teams themselves. The strength that MSF brought to this, MSF's got a pretty good knowledge of Congo and the context of North Kivu. North Kivu is a pretty atypical area to carry out vaccine research because it's an area that's been the center of ongoing conflict for over 20 years. MSF's been working in the Congo for over 25 years. We've got a long history in the area, and we knew the area quite well. And we've got pretty good contacts with the Ministry of Health, with local actors, and that was why we were able to, why we felt like we would be in a good position to play the role of logistic support for the study.
Great, thanks so much, John. I'd like to have another round and ask you all to speak about, thinking about your roles, your institutional role, and what you all brought to that in terms of yourselves and your institutions. To also mention different forms of collaboration that you were directly involved in. So I don't think it's terribly uncommon in the context of a vaccine trial to walk into an office where 3 people who share one office have their paychecks signed by 3 different institutions. So there is always a tremendous amount of overlap and collaboration among different groups. And I just wanted to ask before we get into different degrees of that and how that, that plays out in the field, I just wanted to ask about what are the specific forms of collaboration that each of you and your teams were involved in. And this can be with other partners, research institutions, implementing partners, governments, communities, across different teams. I just would like you to speak directly to the intersections of different groups collaborating. Maybe put up your hand if you'd like to start, or just go ahead. I think we've got time to go all the way around to each of you. John, please.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So we were carrying out the study during an active Ebola outbreak. So that means there was an ongoing response. The study was part of that response, which is, a very delicate thing to do, to carry out research during an epidemic. Unfortunately, the only way to get efficacy data on a vaccine is to vaccinate people at risk of a disease. And so, like I said, since Ebola outbreaks are relatively rare, you need to vaccinate people at risk. That means people near an epidemic. Because we had to, sort of involve ourselves in the response and write ourselves into the response as part of the trial, we had to collaborate very closely with the Ebola response. The Ebola response was huge. This was World Health Organization, Ministry of Health of Congo, CDC, National Institutes of Health, actors from NGOs to local NGOs. And so in doing this, we really had to both collaborate on the backside with the consortium that we were working with, but we also had to collaborate with a host of actors for every decision for the study, that it would also be accepted by the Ebola response, and that it also fit into their strategy. So that was a huge amount of organizing and collaborating and coordinating to be able to, at the same time, be part of an Ebola response and be part of the study.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think that overall there are all kinds of different divides to work across in terms of collaboration. And I think you brought up one of obviously the main ones when you're testing a vaccine in an active outbreak is the research and response agency divide, which I think everyone probably experienced at some point in Sierra Leone as well. Is there anyone, Shelley or Luisa, would you like to talk about collaboration in EBOVAC?
Yeah, I'd just like to sort of give a broader picture, and I think, Luisa, you can go down into the more sort of complexity ways in which you establish relationships and collaborations, particularly in emergency contexts. So when the EBOVAC Sloan trial was being set up, colleagues from LSHTM were going to Sierra Leone who had never been to Sierra Leone before to establish relationships with Ministry of Health and others, and fundamentally establish a relationship with the College of Medical and Health Sciences, so that staff could be recruited through the college. And then obviously, as Robert has talked about, the collaboration with World Vision and others in Cambia. But I think what, from an anthropology, social science, community engagement perspective, became very, very clear immediately, and very fortunate that Luisa had already been living and working and studying in anthropology and politics in Sierra Leone, was the collaboration with the community. And that's where the sort of intense work happens, that you're collaborating with different groups in the community, as well as the newly recruited staff having to sort of establish themselves in the community in this small town in Cambia. So these all happening very, very rapidly. This was at the tail end of the epidemic in Sierra Leone. And also happened as the response activities were tailing off. So people that had been employed and working for other international institutions were now seeking work with the trial. So Luisa, I'll leave you to talk about this, you know, this the sort of specifics of sort of landing in Sierra Leone and sort of negotiating these collaborations, particularly with the community.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really good, good context. And actually, yeah, it's interesting to compare it to what John was saying about North Kivu, because in Sierra Leone, when we started setting up the trial, and Robert will remember this as well, it was a different, quite a different phase of the epidemic. So it had been fairly much, like pretty much fully decentralized. And so you had a district level Ebola response center. And we were in the phase of sort of tailing off, but at the same time, but there were still active cases in the district where we were working. So we were working in parallel with the Ebola response, as well as all the institutions and organizations that Robert and Shelley have already mentioned. But I think on the community side, I'm really glad that you've mentioned this, Shelley, because I think that was really where we came in as anthropologists, was to even, I mean, go almost a step behind what we've been discussing, is to even try to figure out who we needed to be collaborating with. And that wasn't obvious. And one of our kind of key roles as anthropologists was to point out that it wasn't obvious who the collaboration was with, and that we needed research and a better understanding of the community to be able to identify who the key stakeholders were, who the people that were trusted were. And so we spent quite a lot of time working with our research assistants from the town where the trial was taking place, and doing what we call power mapping. So trying to understand within the community, including the Ebola response, but also, you know, including kind of traditional formal and informal authority structures, to set up a community advisory board, and to just basically understand who else we needed to be working with. And this was very much in partnership with World Vision, who are leading on the community engagement. So I'll sort of leave it to Robert, I guess, to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and to just add on what Luisa has just said, in many contexts, the government structure is usually the most powerful in any area you go to. It's the center of authority. But Sierra Leone is also a little bit different. They have chiefdoms, and the paramount chief of a chiefdom becomes the entry to that community. They are also legally, by their constitutions, members of parliament. So one of the key things that came out during the mapping with Luisa's team was, if you wanted to gain entry into Cambia, where the trial was, you needed to have a special collaboration with the paramount chief. He needed to know what this trial was. Why was it being done in his district? Of all the districts, why did they select Cambia? And then he needed to bring his team, because he has a council of cultural leaders that he leads in that district. He needed to bring his team on board. And time was spent to help the paramount chief understand what this trial was about, what were the benefits of the trial, what role he could play, and then assure him that there was nothing that the consortium was going to hide from the community, would be as transparent as possible, and would bring feedback from the community to our teams and use that feedback to improve whatever we are doing. And he eventually came on board and became a chief advisor of this project to help us on how to navigate. Recently, we are doing the evaluation of the communication and community engagement strategy in Cambia, I think 2 months ago. And he advised us, please do it before the curfew and the lockdown happens, because the government is going to institute a lockdown very soon. So I want you to do it. He could give us heads up what the government was planning and how it could help us navigate whatever the planning, and also negotiate. So that is very key. So there is a level of collaboration that goes beyond outside government, that could go beyond international organizations or local, but also looking at the cultural institutions in the area where you're working, and try to create a special bond with them. When the Secretary General of the UN visited DRC, during this outbreak, for one of the groups that he met was the cultural leadership in North Kivu. To have a meeting with them to explain what was going on, what the UN was doing, what support the UN needed from the communities, and see how they could continue working with the cultural leaders to drum up for the advocacy that is required in terms of funding that was in DRC. So we could say that building good collaboration at the community is very critical for vaccine trials or studies or deployment. but also appreciating the various players, like my colleagues have said, John, Luisa, and Shelley, about government, the role of government, the role of the bodies that government has created, special bodies like Ebola response committees that they have created to coordinate that work.
Robert, thanks so much. John, I'll invite you back to speak here. I just want to say, as we go along, I think Rob would like to have some of the other participants go ahead and ask some questions in the chat. So please feel free to put any of your questions in the chat, but I'll continue for now. John, please.
No, I just wanted to kind of bounce off of what Robert was saying, which was the meetings that he was having with these guys in Sierra Leone and North Kivu. I think this is about community engagement in general, but I think what we saw, especially in West Africa and in the North Kivu response, was at the beginning a very top-down sanitary message of wash your hands, social distance. Go to the hospital if you're sick and those sort of things, and not a lot of listening to the community and not a lot of hearing their questions and their concerns. And I think that's one of the big lessons I took out of this response and our activity was this sort of community engagement is not spreading a message or not, sensitizing the population. It's really that's a small part of it, but a big part of it is really listening to what questions do they have, trying to find the answer to their questions, find out what their priorities are, find out what their concerns are, and really try to adapt what you're doing to respond to what they need. And I think that's one of the most important things, is not saying anything, but really listening and hearing their feedback.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. I wanted to ask all of the panelists, as we wait for other people's questions to come in, and I've just seen in the chat that they've actually given, everybody can now mute and unmute themselves. So you can actually interrupt at any time now and ask your own questions or put them in the chat. But I wanted to ask about any of what Gabriella mentioned about marriage counseling. And I think there's something inevitable about an intensely complicated project of, of all kinds of medical and health research, but particularly testing a vaccine in the context of an ongoing epidemic. There's something inevitable about the challenge of aligning all of these different institutional and individual interests, capacities, plans, agendas. And I wonder if any of you can speak to examples of your own learning and change from what Gabriella, I think, wonderfully called marriage counseling, and learning to work together and deal with the inevitable tensions of that come up when such disparate institutions are trying to achieve a really big and really messy goal.
Mark, that's a real loaded question, man.
Yeah, I think it's a lot to work on. I mean, the thing is, I think everybody on the panel has some really wonderful in-depth experience of coming from either, an implementing partner, research institution, and you've really seen in depth the intersections, and you've talked about some of those collaborations. I think it's hard to say, in hindsight, it's really difficult to say, I wish this partner or that partner had done something differently, because we haven't worked in their office and we don't know what their line management was like. So that's a really obviously big, complex, but all of us as individuals in our own roles had to think about how can we change to deal with those tensions. So I just wonder if there are examples of things that you sort of adapted to, or different ways that you might have dealt with tensions in your own role.
Maybe I can start with a couple of reflections. I think it is, it's loaded, but a great question. I mean, for me, on a kind of day-to-day basis in sort of running the anthropological research on the ground, I think that was the biggest learning for me as an individual, kind of having, coming into this primarily from a research perspective, was to learn how to communicate across, not just across institutions, but also across disciplines and kind of backgrounds. And I think people had, came to this trial with very different kinds of experiences, very different types of disciplinary backgrounds, and that matters because when we're doing, on the one hand you have people who are doing clinical research, then there is also kind of are used to kind of social perspectives and so on. And I think that for me, the biggest learning was to figure out how to communicate some of the sort of rich anthropological and social science perspectives that we were collecting on the ground, and how to translate them both in a way that would be helpful for the trial and intelligible to clinicians, for example, but also that it would be operationalizable for, you know, for Robert's team, for example, for community engagement. So not just to sort of, you know, present findings as they were or as they came up and sort of saying this is what participants feel or this is what the community is concerned about, but also kind of working really closely with the community engagement team in particular to sort of say, right, how can we take these findings and make them and translate them into something useful. And that's not always I mean, for me, certainly it wasn't an easy thing to do. And I think that sometimes you kind of, kind of end up pushing against certain walls and boundaries of different people's experiences and different ways of conceptualizing and making sense of the work that we do. So I think it took, I don't know what marriage counseling, but it certainly took a lot of learning on everyone's side in terms of figuring out how we communicated to each other effectively. And I think, you know, with the community engagement team, we ended up setting up what I think was quite a successful system at the end of, you know, from our side, sort of listening, exactly what John said, like listening to communities and understanding concerns and then feeding them back, and the community engagement team acting on it. But that wasn't an immediately obvious thing to do. I think it took us a bit of adjustment to figure out how to do it.
I think personally, I learned. I learned that during emergence and complex situations, it's never good for you to lose your patience, because there's always a thinking that during emergency we must be quick and do things. But sometimes when you're so quick doing things, you end up stepping on many people's toes, or you end up doing the wrong thing because you have not got the technical advice that is required to do that. So one of the things I have learned in these 6 years of the Ebola vaccine trials is try to follow the process and do it well, and be patient even if it's going to take you a few days longer, but not create a crisis out of you trying to be quick. So if you have collaborators that have a critical input in what you're doing, make sure you consult those collaborators. We have been working with Shelley about the social science research. I could have said, okay, Shelley has now told me everything I need to do, let me run with it. But then I run with it and I'm not doing well, and then that undermines the relationship in the collaboration. So we need to be patient and do the right things in trials and studies, and not to rush to do things and do them wrong and then lose the trust of both the collaborators within the organization you're working with and the community, because when things are not done right, it reflects in the work you're doing in the community. It could be sending out a wrong message to the community because it was not pre-tested by those who should have pre-tested it. Then you rush to send it, and now you have to undo that message. Undoing what is in the community becomes extremely difficult. So I learned, coming from a humanitarian ground, which was not clinical trials or studies, we're used to doing things so quick. In this process for vaccines, I've learned that yes, we can still do things quick, but try to be patient and consult as much as possible those that are experts in that field, so that you do not have to undo things with the community where you then lose the trust that the community has already built in you.
Briefly to butt in here, sorry, because it's a really rich discussion to listen to, very enjoyable. I know, Shelley, you had something you wanted to say, but I just wanted to feed in one question from the chat and invite people to add questions into the chat, and feel free to join in the conversations it rolls. And the question was really about how we talked about listening to the community. The question was about how feedback from the community was actually used to make decisions and how that could be done. If anyone's got any examples of how that feedback was actually taken on. But I know, Shelley, you were about to say something else, but I'll leave that other thought in people's minds to feed into the discussion. So go ahead, Shelley, sorry.
Well, actually, I probably was going to respond to that and add
okay.
Okay, yeah, So no, that's okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
No, actually, I mean that sort of feeds in, and I wanted to expand on actually what both Robert and Luisa said. But I think one of the things I learned, and previous to this, as I said, I had worked on an HIV trial that wasn't conducted in the midst of an emergency. So I think one of the challenging things, even within the same institution, you know, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, coming from different disciplines, we had different priorities, and so the clinical team's priority is to follow protocol and ensure that, you know, participants that the procedures are safe, that participants adhere and use the intervention. But I think I learned over that time that as an anthropologist and working closely with community engagement, much of my position was from giving voice to the participants, and how you negotiate participants' needs inside a trial that has very, very tight protocol and procedures for conducting the trial is extremely challenging. And I think that became even more challenging in an emergency. And I think much of that sort of difficulty has been played out in the role of anthropology in response activities, you know, where everything is urgent and reflections from the community may not be able to be addressed or adapted in an urgent situation. How we managed to do that, I think, successfully, certainly in Sierra Leone, and I know we've been my colleague Mifani was just continuing to hopefully link up the community engagement work in DRC with our anthropological work. I think what we did was have regular meetings where we were able to sort of summarize the key points that were coming up during the community engagement and the social science to the clinical team on a regular basis, so that so there were summary points rather than being in depth. And I think that was helpful in the ways that the clinical trial team were able to adjust some of the procedures, but they couldn't adjust the whole protocol. And I think that raises a question about how flexible protocol should be in response to community concerns or participant concerns or difficulties in sort of adhering to some of the procedures at the trial. So I don't know if that answers that question. I think it is a disciplinary perspective, but it's also the different roles within a clinical trial, including the community engagement, social science, and how they fit in to the clinical trial system, which should be quite responsive to the listening. I don't know, Robin, if that answered the question.
I think so, but don't let me get in the way. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question and then the second question. So the first question about collaboration with other partners and how that went, the marriage question, marriage counseling question. I think it was very interesting to work on this project and see how the public health objective of protecting individuals from a very high mortality disease like Ebola, and the scientific objective of, you know, getting efficacy data on a new vaccine sort of aligned. And we had this beautiful moment of, look, we can, with our, you know, interest in protecting individuals from this disease, carry out an activity, and someone, you know, a scientific working with us can carry out their activity and get data. And so even though we had different priorities, each actor had their own, you know, specific interests, specific priorities, and specific ways of working, we had the same overall objective, even though maybe we came at it from different ways. So that was, I think that was what I learned the most, is really like, we don't have to necessarily agree on everything as long as we agree on what we want to accomplish. And of course, there was a lot of growing pains and a lot of, you know, negotiation and working things out, but I think that's normal in any project, and it's even more so when you're working with, you know, very different institutions and ways of working. The second question that was posed in the chat, so it's a really easy question if I talk about the Ebola response, not talking about the study, but about the Ebola response. It was very, very strongly adapted over the 2 years of the outbreak to be a more community-based approach. In the beginning, for most of the response, it was very vertical, highly centralized, controlled by the central government, et cetera. And patients had to be referred a long ways from home to be tested and treated. And towards the end of the outbreak, the response was very much decentralized. People were able to be seen in their local community and tested and treated there. So that was a big improvement. Something that we were able to do in the vaccine trial, it's smaller, but we were able to understand more about where it would be acceptable to put the sites for vaccination, because we were vaccinating in the city of Goma, which is a large city on the eastern side of Congo. And it was important that we chose sites that would be interesting for the study, as far as the most likely sites to receive Ebola cases, as well as sites that could be understood and accepted by the population. And so when we were working out where to vaccinate, originally we were looking at one area of town that only had one certain ethnicity, one certain ethnic group. And it was really through community engagement where we realized that's a bad idea. We need to not call them out or focus on them as this one ethnic group in this area, and we need to spread out where we're vaccinating in several different areas and make it not look like we're targeting one group, which is really what it looked like when we first started looking at different sites. So that was one thing we learned and we're able to adapt. And then another big question was, why are we vaccinating in these two areas? And so since we've been able to sort of, through these discussions, really think about where we're going to target in the city of Goma, we were able to explain, okay, these are really the reasons we chose these sites, and then also make it clear to people that even though we're vaccinating at these sites, anyone can come. It was not limited to the people from those health areas, but really anyone from the city of Goma was welcome to come and get vaccinated. So that was a small adaptation we were able to carry out because of this community feedback.